Subscribe to both of my YouTube channels, Sharron WINBUSH and Goddess Sharron. Turn on notifications and share all videos globally. Thank you. This is a continuation, part 6 of Jennifer Bonjean's motion to acquit Robert Kelly versus the United States of America, filed February 17th, 2022. We're continuing with the AZRIEL CLARY part. We're now on number 7, Racketeering Act 9, Mann Act violations, AZRIEL CLARY / Jane. The government charged defendant with 4 Mann Act violations stemming from a trip with Jane to California between September 15th and October 15th, 2 months before her 18th birthday. According to AZRIEL, she disclosed her true age, 17 years of age, prior to this trip. The government's evidence is insufficient as to these Mann Act violations. A. Racketeering Acts 9A transportation. For the same reasons argued in connection with Racketeering Act 8A, the government failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that defendant transported AZRIEL with the intent of exposing her to herpes in September or October of 2015, and 2, committed a violation of California Health and Safety Code. By proof beyond a reasonable doubt, the arguments set forth supra are equally applicable Racketeering Act 9A. B. Racketeering Acts 9B, coercion or enticement. Insufficient evidence exists to prove that defendant committed Racketeering Act 9B by all accounts. Defendant and Jane were in a serious and legal relationship based in Illinois, where defendant resided in fall of 2015. Although AZRIEL testified that she told defendant her true age after the summer ended in 2015, the record does not reflect precisely when she told the defendant her true age. As such, the government failed to show that defendant possessed the requisite mens rea to sustain a charge of unlawful sexual intercourse with a person under 18 years old under the California Penal Code in September or October 2015. Furthermore, the record is devoid of evidence that defendant took any action to induce, persuade, entice, or coerce Jane into traveling to California between September and October of 2015. Critically, when the defendant learned that Jane had lied about her age, he sent her home to Florida. AZRIEL returned to Chicago with her parents' consent. Although it is true that AZRIEL's parents did not have the authority to consent to any illegal sexual activity between Jane and the defendant, their permission to allow her to stay with defendant is reflective of AZRIEL's desire to continue her relationship with Robert Kelly. AZRIEL offered no testimony to suggest that she was coerced or enticed into traveling to California in fall of 2015. AZRIEL's testimony about defendant's rules and sexual proclivities during this time period are not sufficient evidence to coercion to travel, even if Jane now believes, with the benefit of hindsight, that the defendant's conduct was controlling or constituted some type of grooming. C. Racketeering Act 9C, coercion or enticement. The government charged defendant with the Mann Act violation under the separate theory that the defendant transported AZRIEL to California in September or October 2015 with the intent to violate California Penal Law Sections 261-5 and 261-5B, unlawful sexual intercourse with a person under 18. Preliminarily, the reasons argued supra, the government simply failed to prove that the defendant took any actions to induce, persuade, entice, or coerce AZRIEL into traveling to California. By late 2015, the defendant and AZRIEL were in a serious relationship, based primarily in Illinois, where the defendant resided. The age of consent in Illinois is 17. The age of consent in the state of Illinois is 17. Therefore, the defendant, Robert Kelly, and AZRIEL Clary's sexual relationship was not prohibited in the state of Illinois. AZRIEL traveled with Robert to numerous states as one of his partners, as his girlfriend. She went consensually and voluntarily. Defendant did not have to induce, persuade, entice, or coerce her to travel, even if the government is correct that the defendant had exerted some dominance or control in the relationship at the time. Furthermore, as argued in connection with Racketeering Act 5, the government provided insufficient evidence that the defendant used any words to induce, persuade, entice, or coerce AZRIEL to travel to California via a facility of interstate commerce. Under the plain reading of the statute, there must be a nexus between the use of the facility of interstate commerce, a cell phone, a computer, and the words of persuasion, enticement, or coercion to satisfy 2422B violation. The record is devoid of that proof. The mere fact that the defendant texted with AZRIEL about any number of things does not satisfy the interstate commerce element of this Mann Act violation. Racketeering Act 9D, transportation. If it is true that the state of California, the age of consent is 18, according to AZRIEL, she had sexual relations with the defendant in California during this trip when she was still 17 years of age. However, the government failed to prove the defendant guilty of the Mann Act under this theory, where a defendant's motivating purpose in traveling to California was not to have sex with AZRIEL. The defendant and AZRIEL had a consensual and legal relationship in the state of Illinois. Defendant's purpose in traveling to California was to perform, and he arranged for his girlfriend to go with him. If the defendant had sexual relationships with AZRIEL in California in September and October, it was purely incidental to the purpose of the trip, as AZRIEL herself testified when asked, question, and while you were 17, did you take additional trips to California with the defendant? Yes, I did. Do you remember where you traveled to? I do not. Do you remember what the purpose of the travel was for? He had shows. In her own words, she's saying Robert Kelly, the defendant, was attending his concerts in California. No rational juror could find that the government proved that defendant's motivating purpose in transporting AZRIEL to California was to have sexual intercourse with her, particularly where he had an ongoing legal and consensual sexual relationship with her in the state of Illinois where he resided. At bottom, no nexus exists between the transportation of AZRIEL and the alleged illegal sexual activity. This is where you see they completely were overreaching. He, by law, was legally involved with AZRIEL in Illinois, which is where he lived. That's where she traveled to be with him. That's where their home was. That's where they were living. Then he has to go perform in California. He brings his girlfriend with him, and the government, because they can't apply anything in Illinois, want to apply it to California, where the age of consent is 18. 8. Racketeering Act 10, sexual exploitation of AZRIEL Clary. The government failed to prove Racketeering Act 10, that is sexual exploitation of AZRIEL, where it offered insufficient evidence that defendant used, employed, persuaded, induced, or enticed AZRIEL to take part in sexually explicit conduct for the purpose of producing a visual depiction between September of 2015 and December 30th, when she turned 18. The government contends that prior to AZRIEL's 18th birthday, defendant recorded his sexual experiences with her in California. To demonstrate that defendant committed sexual exploitation of a child pursuant to 18 U.S.C. 225, it is not enough for Jane to simply allege that defendant recorded sexually explicit conduct. AZRIEL offered no testimony to provide or to that provided that defendant used persuaded, induced, enticed, or coerced her into sexually explicit conduct during the relevant time period. AZRIEL had an ongoing sexual relationship with the defendant. AZRIEL had an ongoing sexual relationship with defendant before the video recording incident and after the video recorded incident. Although AZRIEL seems to regret those experiences, she did not offer sufficient evidence of enticement or coercion. The government must prove that defendant did something more than just film the sexually explicit conduct if the act of filming or recording alone was sufficient to sustain the charge. Congress would not have included a requirement that the defendant employ, persuade, induce, entice, or coerce. Furthermore, the government failed to prove that defendant acted with a purpose of producing a visual depiction of that conduct. Although the jury was erroneously charged that the government could sustain the charge by proving that the purpose was transmitting a visual depiction, the statute requires something different indeed. Producing is defined by the statute as producing, directing, manufacturing, issuing, publishing, or advertising. While the statute also prohibits the transmission of live visual depictions, defendant was not charged with transmitting a live visual depiction, and there is no evidence that he did. Accordingly, the government failed to prove Racketeering Act 10 by proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Number 9, Racketeering Act 11, Forced Labor of AZRIEL CLARY. The government charged defendant with forced labor of AZRIEL under a theory that defendant required AZRIEL to participate in sex with other men and other women. Although at trial, AZRIEL claimed that she did not want to participate in those activities and that she did not enjoy those activities for the 5 years she was with him. That does not mean AZRIEL was forced to participate in those activities. If AZRIEL refuses, even now, to allege that she was forced by threats of violence to engage in certain sex acts, it is unclear why the government believes she was. Again, belatedly acknowledging that one really did not want to participate in the conduct is not the equivalent of being forced. The record is devoid of any evidence that Jane was forced within the meaning of the statute to have sex with individuals other than the defendant, or that she was prohibited in any way from extricating herself from the relationship, meaning she could have left sometime within the 5 years of her relationship. The government's evidence that AZRIEL was forced to participate in these sexual acts consisted of Alex's nephew, that was his nickname, testimony that some women he had sex with were zombie-ish, and that the defendant had directed women other than AZRIEL to participate in group sex. Rather than point the jury to specific evidence from AZRIEL's testimony that reflected that she had been forced to participate in these activities through violence, restraint, or threat of violence, the government argued that defendant had directed Dominique to have sexual intercourse with Alex. So they produced nothing about AZRIEL, but nephew testified he had sex with Dominique. That's not even related to AZRIEL, so why would they admit that? While the government was permitted to offer an extraordinary amount of uncharged bad act evidence for various purposes, such evidence cannot supplant the government's burden to show that AZRIEL herself was forced to participate in group sex acts. The evidence offered was insufficient proof of the offense of forced labor, as discussed in connection with Racketeering Act 6. The government cannot establish the offense of forced labor by simply showing that the defendant and Jane had a sexual relationship that some might consider abusive. The government was required to establish a causal link between the group sex acts and threats of physical violence. It failed to do so. The Mute R. Kelly campaign stopped the flow of R. Kelly's income. Sony releasing him hemorrhaged him financially. His inability to tour. He had back taxes because of poor management and accounting, that the government seized assets for that. And then he had back child support. He's been not in a position to hire the top-notch legal team necessary to get through this entire case, which is why he was compromised in the New York case. He needs all his fans, supporters, or anyone who wants to help to send money directly to him, not through a third party, because he has an upcoming Chicago case, and he must have great legal representation to defend himself to the best of his ability. Mr. Kelly is fighting a case in Chicago, and he needs all of the assistance that anyone can give from all of his fans and supporters around the world. There are 3 ways that you can get money to Mr. Kelly. 1, you can send money via Western Union. That's for $300 or less. That will get to him fast. Or you can go to the BOP.gov website and send money via credit card. Those are the fastest ways to get it to him. Or you can mail a money order to him to P.O. Box 474701, Des Moines, Iowa, 50947-0001. It will go directly to Mr. Kelly, no third party, no one in between, and he will have a record of who sent what amount, and from where it was sent. So it is your way to directly help, directly impact, to directly put your hands on R. Kelly and show him that you love him, show that his fans from around the world are supporting him, and they want to assist him in fighting for his freedom.